Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. This episode starts a new series on philosophy and the law. In a wide-ranging discussion, our guest Kyle Fritz introduces some of the key issues at the intersection of free will and the law.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Kyle Fritz, Assistant Professor in the Department of Public Policy Leadership at the University of Mississippi. Kyle's interested in several issues having to do with moral authority and standing, including the standing to blame, a topic that he's published several articles on, sometimes co-authoring with Dan Miller, a former guest of this podcast. Kyle also spends a lot of time teaching on issues related to public policy and the philosophy of law, and he's graciously agreed to give us an introduction to some issues at the intersection of free will and the law, which will be our focus on this season of the podcast. So thanks and welcome to the show, Kyle. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will and or the law?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Matt and Taylor.
Of course.
I got my PhD in philosophy from Florida State in 2016 and went to Florida State because of the free will sort of interest. I have been interested in free will since around high school, I think, and that continued up through undergrad and then grad school. And I was interested in free will because I was raised in the Presbyterian Church. And one of those Presbyterian tenets is Calvinism, or this sort of idea of predestination. And our church didn't really hammer that idea home. But once I heard about it, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. You know, what does that mean for my free will and my agency if people are just predestined to be saved or not? And so that led me to philosophy, and in particular to free will. So, a dissertation that I worked on was about responsibility for the non-voluntary. But as you mentioned, for the past 6 years or so, I've been working on the ethics of blame. And so what that means is when people think about free will, usually they're thinking about whether a person's responsible, what it takes for an agent to be responsible. You've spent a lot of time on your show talking about those sorts of questions. My work comes after those questions. So supposing that somebody is responsible and blameworthy for some wrongdoing, that doesn't automatically mean that we should blame them. There could be various ethical considerations that bear on whether we ought to blame blameworthy agents, right? So if the person feels really guilty, is beating themselves up, maybe we shouldn't blame them, maybe as much as they deserve, or maybe not blame them at all. As you said, probably the most talked about sort of condition is that of moral standing or the right to blame. So a lot of people think that being hypocritical in some respects means that you don't have the standing to blame for that sort of thing. So if I'm unrepentantly guilty of pirating music, for instance, I would lack the standing to blame somebody else for pirating music, even if they're blameworthy for that, right? So the key thing there is that it doesn't mean they're not responsible for it. It just means those facts that they are responsible don't settle whether I, in particular, should blame them for that. So since my department is multidisciplinary, we're focused on public policy applications. So I've been trying to think through some of those practical implications for standing, especially on the work that I've done. And that's been applied in issues in leadership and conscientious objection policy, and then, as you mentioned, punishment.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks.
Yeah, very cool. When people hear free will in the law, probably one of their first thoughts will be about punishment. And this topic has come up before on the podcast, especially when we've talked about the implications of skepticism about free will and moral responsibility. We plan to talk more about punishment this season, but we wanted to start with a very basic question. What exactly is punishment?
Yeah, it's a very important question to ask, and it's not as straightforward as you might think. So there's no consensus among philosophers about what punishment is. Some have even suggested that it's futile to try to find a precise definition of punishment. But it's important, I think, to be clear on what punishment is, or at least what we think we're talking about, because a very closely related question is whether we ought to punish. And if we don't even know what punishment is, it's hard to answer whether we ought to do it in the first place. So when we start thinking about punishment, a lot of people find it plausible that punishment has to cause harm or be burdensome in some way. It doesn't mean necessarily physical harm. It could be, right? You could have corporal punishment, but we use prisons in the U.S. And that can be psychologically as well as physically harmful. But there's also this burden of being cut off from the rest of society, including your family and friends, for an extended period. We also use fines, which don't necessarily cause pain, right? But the idea is that we're trying to set back somebody's interests. We're making them worse off than they would have otherwise been. Now, even starting with that, that punishment has to make people worse off than they otherwise would have been, it seems pretty innocuous at first, but there are already going to be some worries here, which is just, do we have to actually make the person worse off, or is it enough that we tried to make the person worse off? So if an unhoused person, for instance, it's winter, they're looking for a warmer place to sleep, they might commit, a minor theft just so they can spend the night in jail. For many people, spending a night in jail, that's going to make them worse off, but not in this particular case, right? So you'd think, well, did we actually punish that person? And the people who say no think you have to actually set back the person's interests. But some would say, we actually did punish the unhoused person because, generally speaking, for most people, being in jail sets back your interests and makes them worse off. I think the clearest sort of example for this is usually when we think about fines. To a single parent, works a minimum wage job, a $200 traffic fine is a big deal. Yeah. To somebody like Elon Musk, $200 is nothing. He's not even going to notice that it's gone. So to a wealthy person, it doesn't seem like we've actually punished them at all because we haven't made them worse off. And if we haven't punished them, it seems unfair that the single parent gets punished, but the wealthy person doesn't. Right. So that's the first sort of component to punishment. But usually we also think the harm needs to be intended. So you can't accidentally punish somebody. This is, again, a disputed point. Yeah. But
what isn't a disputed point?
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's philosophy, so it's all disputed. But the intention helps differentiate between punishment and something like quarantine, right? So the free will skeptics like Greg Caruso, you mentioned you had those sorts of folks on the show before who advocate quarantining certain people who aren't responsible, but nevertheless do wrong. And when we put somebody in quarantine, we can foresee that they're going to be harmed. We're all aware of the negative effects of physical and mental health on quarantine after COVID-19 pandemics, right? So the goal, though, is not to cause harm. It's just a regrettable fact that you're going to face some harm when we isolate you. So there's harm, there's intention, but just intentionally harming someone probably isn't enough for punishment either. So that third key idea is that we have to punish them, or intentionally harm them rather, for some perceived offense. If I'm walking down the street and I choose somebody at random and I punch them in the face, I've intentionally caused harm. It's a little bit weird to call that punishment, though. I didn't punch them on the basis of anything they did, right? So if I punch them because they insult my dog, right, that seems more like punishment. I intentionally caused them harm for some perceived offense. So it's important here that it's perceived as an offense because sometimes we're mistaken, right? Yeah. So some people are put in prison for crimes they didn't commit. We intentionally harm them because we think they did something wrong. It would be really bad if down the line we could say, oh, hey, we got evidence that you were innocent. So those 10 years in prison, that wasn't actually punishment because you didn't actually commit the crime. It was punishment. It was just unjust punishment, right? And then there's two other criteria that are usually talked about with respect to punishment. Some say punishment has to express some kind of disapproval or blame. So that can be of the offense, it can be of the offender, it could be both. But that the idea is that punishment necessarily involves some kind of blame. And that's what sets punishment apart from, like a simple penalty. It shows how seriously we take the wrongdoing. But there are folks who have said, no, we can have dispassionate punishment. Tommy Shelby, for instance, thinks you can have dispassionate punishment. Aaron Kelly thinks that blame just doesn't belong in criminal justice. So there are folks who would disagree with that sort of idea. And the last component is more straightforward, which is just punishment probably requires some kind of authority. And in fact, that helps to distinguish the sort of punishment we're talking about. So legal or criminal punishment requires the authority of the state. But there can also be, institutional punishment. So where your employer has the authority to punish you for violating the company policy. Maybe there could be interpersonal punishment, like in the case of me punching the person in the face who insulted my dog. You could even have vigilante punishment. Batman doesn't have the authority of the state, but he's still out possibly punishing people for what they do. So to sort of sum it all up, a definition of punishment could be that X legally punishes Y just in case X, in some official capacity on behalf of the state, intentionally harms Y for some perceived offense, thereby expressing disapproval of the offense or the offender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nice. All right, here's a quick follow-up. Since we'll dive deeper on this topic in a later episode, could you tell us what some of the main theories of the justification for punishment are?
Yeah, so if punishment by definition involves a kind of intentionally imposed harm or burden, then obviously a natural sort of question is, well, can we justify that harm or burden? So you can think about the question of justification in two ways. There's just the people who think that punishment is justified and the people who think punishment is not justified. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but more commonly, a lot of people think punishment is justified. And so the debates really are among the people who think punishment is justified, but they don't agree on why it's justified. So classically in that group, there are three main camps. So there's consequentialist theories, there's retributivist theories, and then there's these mixed or hybrid theories.
Yeah.
So consequentialists think that punishment is justified by the consequences that punishment produces. So they think the harm involved in punishment is a bad thing, of course, but if we can offset that harm with good consequences, then the punishment's sort of a worthwhile trade-off. So what would be the good consequences of punishment? Well, in general, the answer is usually something like crime reduction. So punishment can reduce crime in various ways. The big three are through deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. If I commit a crime and I get punished as a result, then in the future, when I'm tempted to commit a crime, I might remember that harm that I suffered and be like, oh, no, I'm not going to do that after all. So that's specific deterrence, where we're deterring a specific sort of person, in this case, me. But punishment can also serve this function of general deterrence, where, if either of you are tempted to commit a crime, for instance, but you see, well, I saw how Kyle got punished, I'm not going to do that, right? Then that might deter you from committing the crime. So whether it's specific or general deterrence, one way punishment can lead to those good consequences is by preventing people from committing future crimes. And those future crimes would lead to more harm. So the thought is it's better to inflict some harm on a person now to avoid there being even more harm in the future. Right. So something similar can be said about the incapacitation, right? Some see punishment is justified because it incapacitates a person. It prevents them from committing the crime again. If you're in prison, you're not able to commit crimes in society. But we also incapacitate in other ways. So we take away licenses, professional licenses for malpractice, for instance, to incapacitate people. And then the last sort of point there for consequentialists is that they could justify punishment by using rehabilitation. So even though punishment's burdensome and harmful, if it changes the person so they won't commit crimes in the future, then punishment's justified, right? So rehabilitation actually has more benefits as well, consequentially speaking. If we can successfully rehabilitate an offender, we get to have them back in the community. So that's going to create positive results for their family, their friends, their community, their employer, all that stuff. So consequentialists can appeal to just one of those goals, deterrence, incapacitation, or rehabilitation, but usually they'll appeal to some combination of them. Right. But the main point is that the harms that we inflict on somebody via punishment are worth it, so to speak, because they lead to better consequences down the line. So I'm sure you'll get into this when you talk about justifications of punishment in your future episode, but there are several objections that have been raised to consequentialist theories. I'm not going to go into all those, but I'll just mention one because it leads to the next sort of theory. So consequentialism seems like it justifies punishments that are impermissible.
Yeah.
If we could reduce more crime by punishing an innocent person, consequentialists say, yeah, let's do it. So if an angry mob thinks that I'm guilty of something, and they're going to destroy a lot of property or something if I'm not punished, it looks like the harms that I endure are going to be outweighed by whatever future benefits we get, right, by punishing me. So there's also this worry that it justifies punishing people excessively. So if your goal is to deter crime, you want to make sure the punishment's so severe nobody ever wants to commit a crime, right? So I would watch my speed a lot more closely if I would get 5 years in prison for speeding. Right?
As would all of us.
Right. So what those concerns with consequentialism raise is that punishment should be deserved and it should be proportional. So we shouldn't punish innocent people, and we should make sure that the punishment fits the crime, right? A common sort of saying. So those two ideas are crucial for the notion of retributivism, the next theory of punishment. There's different varieties of retributivism. I won't get into all of those. I'll just mention that there are maybe the two most common ones that get talked about are positive retributivism and negative retributivism. Those go by different names, but I use positive and negative personally. So positive retributivists think that the fact that somebody's guilty of wrongdoing is in principle sufficient reason to punish them to whatever degree they deserve, right? So the guilt provides a positive reason to punish them because they deserve it. So even if the punishment won't lead to any good consequences like crime reduction. So for an example, suppose I kill somebody, but in the process, I become paralyzed. So I'm unable to kill anybody in the future. I'm already incapacitated.
Yeah.
And suppose that I'm incredibly stubborn. I'm never going to be reformed, right? And suppose that the state tells everybody that I'm being punished in prison, right? So if anybody's thinking about punishing or killing somebody, they're deterred from that. Is there any reason to punish me? Well, consequentialists might say, well, it doesn't bring about any good consequences, right? But a retributivist would say, yeah, there's a reason to punish you. It's because you deserve it. You did something bad and you deserve it. So you can contrast a positive retributivist with a negative retributivist. And a negative retributivist thinks that desert's just a constraint on punishment. So in other words, desert's necessary for punishment, but it's not sufficient. So it gets you in the door, but it doesn't tell us whether we should actually punish you. So proportional punishment should only be doled out to people who deserve it. But just because you're guilty of a crime doesn't mean we should punish you. So usually negative retributivists are going to appeal to consequentialist considerations to determine whether we should actually punish you. So if the punishment doesn't bring about any good consequences, even though you're guilty, maybe we shouldn't punish you. The benefit of the negative retributivist over consequentialism is we shouldn't punish innocent people, which was one of the problems, right? Because they don't deserve it. As I mentioned, there's other varieties of retributivism. I won't get into those. The key for retributivism is just desert, and different theories are going to explain why an offender deserves punishment in different ways. But for retributivists, what's crucial is having a plausible explanation for why we should think people deserve punishment and what a proportional punishment might be. And those are, I think, familiar questions in free will discussions, right? Because they bring back all the familiar worries about whether anybody can deserve anything, blame, punishment, right? And the skeptics who think we don't have free will, they're going to think we can't deserve punishment. So retributivism is just sort of a non-starter for them.
Right.
So in light of those problems that consequentialists have and then maybe retributivists have, you could try to see if we can mix those. So the third sort of theory is like a mixed or hybrid theory. And what you're trying to go for here is to get all the benefits of the theories with none of the drawbacks.
Right.
But it's not clear that you can get that, right? Yeah. So the negative retributivism I mentioned is actually a mixed view, right? Desert kind of puts a limiter on who can be punished, but consequences provide the reason to punish. And there's various ways you can try to mix the theories. But the main worry for mixed views is that consequentialism and retributivism are just too different to mix, or like oil and water, right? So, most critics of mixed views rely on the idea that they're primarily either retributivist or consequentialist with just some little other bit tacked on, without much justification. So when you think about negative retributivism, you might say, well, it just sounds like consequentialism, but you tailor-made this desert constraint to avoid this objection. So what explains how those things fit together, right? That's been much more mysterious and tougher to explain. So those are the three main camps of the people who think punishment is justified. We've got consequentialism, retributivism, mixed views. But as I mentioned, there are people who think punishment's just not justified at all. And those would be punishment abolitionists. So the thought there would be all the current theories on offer have problems or they fail for some reason. So the reasonable thing to do is conclude punishment's not justified after all. So, for instance, consequentialists think that punishment is justified by its effects on crime reduction. But you might think, well, is punishment the best or most effective way to reduce crime? If not, maybe it's not going to be justified in the end. So since all these theories have their problems, abolitionists say we should look for something else. What's crucial there is that even if punishment's not justified, the abolitionist doesn't say, well, we just can't do anything in response to crime, right? There might be other routes that we could go. So maybe we should implement something like restorative justice, for instance, where we're focused on restoring the relationship between the victim and the offender, as well as the relationship between the offender and the community. That can happen through mediation, right? Can involve reparations for the community. But the goal in all of that is not hard treatment. It's not burden. It's restoration. And so that's why that wouldn't count as punishment on that definition.
Right. Wow, that was a lot, but that was really helpful. So thanks for going through all that, Kyle. Besides the term punishment, I think another term that free will in the law might bring to mind is mens rea, which refers to the state of mind of a person committing a crime, state of their mind in contrast to their overt behavior and its consequences. This is something we'll also spend an episode on later this season. But I wanted to ask you about something you've written about, namely the issue of standing. Even assuming a person's morally and even legally responsible for some crime, some argue that the state can lack the appropriate authority or standing to dole out deserved punishment. So could you introduce some of those reasons?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most fascinating topics with regard to punishment personally, just because even if we settle the question of whether punishment is justified and what justifies it, it might be the case that nevertheless there's still something wrong with the state punishing people. So punishment could be justified in principle, but not in practice. So I'll start with the case of interpersonal blame so that we can then extrapolate out to the state. So normally, as I mentioned with the examples of ethics of blame and explaining my work, we focus on what sort of conditions an agent needs to satisfy to be responsible. But if we think about the ethics of blame, we're worried about what sort of facts about the person blaming might matter and how that might matter. So the fact that I would be hypocritical in blaming you for stealing books or pirating music or whatever, that suggests that I don't have the right to blame you for doing that. You could say, look who's talking, or who are you to judge me? And the thought is not that you're not responsible or blameworthy. It's just I shouldn't be calling you to account given my own track record. So focusing on the features of the agent who is blaming is going to be focusing on moral standing. I think of moral standing as a moral right. It's like an entitlement that you have to blame someone else, maybe also a sort of power to call them to account, to answer to you for the wrongdoing. But if you as a blamer don't satisfy certain criteria, you would lack that right, or it might be defeated by these other sort of considerations. So hypocrisy could be one of those. But people also point to complicity as a concern, right? If I help you steal books, I don't have the right to blame you for stealing books. I was involved in it myself, right? So there's other sort of conditions that could fit there with standing, but those are the two that are relevant for us. So that's focused on interpersonal blaming. The fact that the blame would be hypocritical or complicit, that might mean that you lack the standing to blame for that particular wrongdoing. But we're thinking about the state, right? So there, part of this depends on the idea that blame is part of that definition of punishment, right? So punishment functions as a way to condemn the wrongdoer for their crime. So then the question becomes, well, does the state have the moral standing or the right to blame criminal offenders through punishment? And several theorists have said no, because that's going to be hypocritical or the state's going to be complicit. Those are the two of the main sort of big reasons. So with hypocrisy, the idea is, and this is something that's been brought to the forefront by R.A. Duff. It's not a secret that in a lot of countries, at least in the U.S., there's significant social inequality, right? This could be wealth inequality. It could be unequal treatment due to race. But by failing to protect the interests and the rights of socially disadvantaged people, the state has, in a way, sort of excluded them from the community, and it's failed to show them a certain level of respect. But that same respect for the community is what's going to justify the state in punishing criminal offenders in the first place. So crimes typically involve failing to respect a person and treating them as if they aren't a full member of the moral community. When the state punishes crimes, it says to the victim and the wrongdoer that, this disrespect and exclusion, it's not going to be tolerated. But the state's guilty of the same wrongdoing. It fails to respect and include certain members of the community with its social policies. So it would be hypocritical for the state to blame offenders through punishment for something that it itself is guilty of. That's the thought with the hypocrisy. A different but related concern that Victor Tadros has raised is the state's complicit in the crimes of the socially disadvantaged. And people, I think, generally have found this line more persuasive than the hypocrisy argument. So the idea here is the state knows that certain policies are criminogenic, right, that they cause crime, or at least it should. There's plenty of data out there showing that social inequality is connected to increased crime. The state continues to implement these problematic policies that further social inequality, or at least it doesn't properly address the social inequality. So since the state is, at least in some sense, responsible for the social inequality, and that social inequality is what causes the crime, then the state seems to be at least partially to blame for the wrongdoers committing these crimes, right? So if it's involved in wrongdoing, it lacks the right to hold the wrongdoers to account via punishment. I think Tadros says the state would be sitting as judge when it should be sitting as co-defendant. So there are other explanations for the state lacking the standing to blame offenders via punishment. I've argued that the state, the fact that the state gives impoverished offenders or people of color harsher punishments undermines their standing to blame, because even that unjustified, inconsistent blame can have an impact on standing. But importantly, just because the state lacks the right to blame doesn't mean that it shouldn't punish, all things considered. So most theorists writing on the state standing also point out the state has a responsibility to protect its citizens and to respect them, and that's going to require respecting the victims of crimes, right? So even if the state lacks a standing to blame, it doesn't automatically mean that they shouldn't do anything in response to crime. But we shouldn't feel good about it. We shouldn't feel good about punishment in that case. There's other people like Tommy Shelby who suggested that the state would be justified in punishing without a condemning element involved, right? Sort of dispassionate punishment. And I should note that within the past few years, there have been several theorists, Andre Poama and Benjamin Yost in particular, who they've come out with strong criticisms of these sorts of arguments that the state lacks a standing to blame. So this is unfolding sort of debate, but I think a really interesting one.
Yeah. Another free will in the law topic that has come up on the podcast before is about rehabilitation of criminal offenders. And more specifically, we talked with Gabriel DeMarco about concerns about the use of neurointerventions. Maybe in addition to those concerns, what are some other interesting issues surrounding rehabilitation?
One of the first issues that I think is worth considering is what we even mean by rehabilitation, right? So should neurointervention count as rehabilitation? There's a really great paper by Lisa Forsberg and Thomas Douglas that explores what this notion of rehabilitation means. So I'll briefly sort of talk about what they say. But first, by rehabilitation, you could just mean you're keeping the person from reoffending, right? So the goal is just avoiding recidivism. And in the policy world, that's usually the statistical measure that you determine how well we're rehabilitating, right? So when people say the U.S. doesn't rehabilitate, they're pointing out the high recidivism rate. But that's a pretty weak notion of retributivism, of rehabilitation, not retributivism. So a little stronger is the idea that rehabilitation means we cure or alleviate some sort of mental deficit related to the person's past offense. So we could give them therapy, for instance. And if neurointervention fits in here, it could apply here, right? So we can go about trying to address an individual's issues in various ways. Some of those, like in therapy, might involve helping them take responsibility and work through those issues, but maybe it could also involve directly intervening in their brains, right, to improve their agency. That's going to raise, of course, a lot of ethical questions and concerns, but the way in which we offer that conception of rehabilitation would matter, right? So another notion of rehabilitation that we could use is to try to make the offender a better person, morally speaking. So that might go beyond therapy in requiring a sort of moral training or moral education of some sort. Or rehabilitation could mean that we restore the offender's moral and social relationships. So for that, we probably need the offender to demonstrate remorse, to reconcile with the victim and their family. So that's going to be closely related to that notion of restorative justice that I mentioned earlier. So the first, interesting issue, I guess, with rehabilitation is just what it even is. But regardless, on virtually every understanding, the U.S. does a bad job of rehabilitating. Our recidivism rate is about 66%. Prisons don't really have or focus, at least, on therapy or rehabilitation. In fact, a lot of prisons, people would say, are counterproductive for rehabilitation because people need social relationships, they need education, they need intellectual stimulation. That can seriously damage your mental health if you don't have those things. But many prisons use solitary confinement. They don't get people to have those sort of social relationships and intellectual stimulation. So in the US, you're probably worse off leaving prison than you were going in. And that, again, leads us to the standing question, right? What right does the state have to blame offenders when it sets them up to fail by punishing them in ways that negatively impact their agency? I think another significant question is just whether people can be rehabilitated at all. So before the 1970s, there was a significant focus on rehabilitation and punishment, but it didn't seem like anything worked. So that kind of started us on this turn toward retributivism, which we're still seeing the effects of today, right? So that's, I think, just it's a psychological question. Whether people can change and get better, I hope they can, but it's an empirical question. It's also important that, even if some people can change, it doesn't mean that everybody can be rehabilitated, right? I think probably related to neurointervention in particular, the most significant sort of question here is, if people can be rehabilitated, how does that happen? And what sort of ethical constraints are there on how we rehabilitate people? So the direct intervention through neurointervention, that seems sort of wrong to bypass somebody's agency. It seems disrespectful. It's treating people as things to be manipulated. But there are less invasive ways that we can affect people's behavior. So in the early 2000s, Bernard Gesch did a study where half of a group of prisoners got supplements that included omega-3 fatty acids, and the other half got placebos. And over time, the group of prisoners who had the supplements had reduced antisocial behaviors, but the control group didn't. So studies since then have suggested that these fatty acids can have a significant impact on antisocial behavior. So could we just work toward rehabilitation by ensuring that offenders get the right nutrition?
Just add them to all the food in the cafeteria.
Is that a concern? Is that problematic for agency? That's another sort of important question, right? What are the limits here? But also, there's probably for some people a question here about what that says about free will and responsibility in the first place, right? So does the fact that humans who don't get enough fatty acids are more antisocial show that they're not free will, or they're not free and they're not responsible, and so we shouldn't even be punishing them to begin with, right? I don't think so, but you can see how an argument for that could be made. Right. I think the last issue to mention with rehabilitation is it's not clear how rehabilitation and punishment are easily compatible, at least generally, right? So if we have this sort of strong retributivist mindset, especially. So it's usually not productive to treat people harshly. You think about how you might have responded or how you're tempted to respond if somebody blames you, they condemn you, they call you out for some sort of mistake, versus if they say, more gently, like, hey, this was a mistake, they try to understand why you did it, they try to help you avoid it in the future, right? That second method is going to get better results, but it doesn't involve that sort of harsh treatment that we often associate with retributivism. Right. And in fact, that's what we see in places like Norway. So prisons in Norway, they're much nicer than here in the US. The recidivism rate is 20%. Ours is 66%. So you've got staff and guards who are trained in psychology and sociology, and they treat inmates like people, with the thought that, if you treat somebody like a person, they'll act like a person. If you treat somebody like a monster, they're going to act like a monster. So there's an important sort of question of how we balance the goal of rehabilitation in punishment with the retributivist leanings that we see, especially here in the U.S., and that just brings us back to that tension that's involved in mixed justifications of punishment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, switching gears a little bit, we also plan to spend several episodes this season on the freedom and responsibility of atypical agents, sometimes called marginal agents, agents such as young children, psychopaths, those suffering addictions. We could spend whole seasons of the podcast on these sort of cases, but we'll try to keep it brief for now. What are some of the legal issues that arise and how we should punish or respond to marginal agents who break the law?
Yeah, so a lot of the concerns that arise with how we treat children, psychopaths, people with addictions, stems from the fact that they likely have some reduced agency in some way or another. So what that means for how we should legally respond when they commit some crime could depend in part on your justification for punishment. If you're a retributivist, you might think, well, if somebody has less agency, they're less responsible, so they're less blameworthy. And so we need to mitigate our punishment to reflect that because they deserve less punishment. But if you're a consequentialist, you might think if someone has less agency, it just won't do as much good to punish them a certain way, right? They can't respond in the way that we want them to. So a lot of it's just going to depend on details of the case. And I think there's interesting distinctions between children and people with addiction and psychopaths, actually. So children don't have fully developed brains yet. The prefrontal cortex, which controls our ability to delay gratification, to sort of reflect on our choices and weigh the risks and have social intelligence and empathy, that part of the brain doesn't fully mature until we're 25. So it's going to be a lot harder for children to make rational, disciplined decisions. They're going to be more impulsive, less reflective, less reasons reactive. And even in cases, these horrible cases where children commit some sort of premeditated murder, they might just not have the mental capacity to fully appreciate what they've done. So the meaning of that action is going to be different from that of a fully matured agent who, maliciously plans a murder. And presumably then the way the state responds should reflect that difference. But unfortunately, that hasn't really been the case at least in some states. So, for example, Mississippi, where I live, they still give out life without parole for some juveniles, most of whom are Black. And in fact, until 2005, children were eligible for the death penalty. So those kinds of punishments, philosophically have very little to back them, but they're supported by this sort of social climate that demands being tough on crime. I think the important thing to remember about children when we think about atypical agents is they're only atypical for a bit, right? Hopefully. So they're going to get that agency and responsibility as they mature. And so we might think, well, if that's the case, it might seem problematic to give them a long-term, strict sort of sentence where they have to stay in prison for the rest of their life with no chance of parole, knowing they're going to change, right? Hopefully, or they could change. So we might say juveniles are less blameworthy for their actions, right, and deserve less punishment. But you also just might say, consequentially speaking, it's expensive to put some of these folks in prison, juveniles in prison for life. It's probably also not reducing crime that much because after a certain age, they're probably going to age out of crime anyway, right? Treating them harshly is going to do more harm than good, right? As I mentioned before about rehabilitation. So yeah, there's a long way to go there before we can say that we've really respected the reduced agency of juveniles, but that would be at least one of those main sort of concerns there. And I think, just to touch on the addiction and psychopathy, the same sort of thing is going to apply here, right? The worry with children is that they're impulsive, right? People with addictions might similarly be impulsive and have less control. They're less able to resist those urges due to their brain chemistry. So that might be important. Now, you might think, well, we could trace back. I mean, if I started smoking meth tomorrow, I know that I'm going to get addicted and probably will do things that I shouldn't do as a result. So maybe we can hold you responsible because we can sort of trace back that choice. But it gets more complicated because a lot of people with addictions probably started when they were younger, right? When they were those kids with the undeveloped prefrontal cortex, they didn't really appreciate those sorts of risks. So there's lots of social and cultural factors that can bear on that and reduce those sort of responsibility for that.
Yeah.
And you might also just wonder from a consequentialist perspective, what's the point of giving somebody with an addiction harsh treatment in prison? Some people will say, well, it's good for them to get sober. It's good for them to go there. They can kind of dry out or whatever. But there are drugs in prison. We know that, right? Mm-hmm. And there's safer and more effective ways to help people get rehabilitated, probably. So the other sort of notion is the notion of deterrence. If you're justifying punishment with deterrence, you need people to be able to properly weigh risks and understand those force of those reasons. But if you've got an agent who doesn't have addiction and another agent who has addiction, the agent who has addiction might see, yep, I could get in trouble for this, but I just can't lower the weight of my reason to engage in this behavior because I need this substance. Yeah. So it's just not going to be as useful. And I think the thing about psychopaths is that they have, they're violent, they're antisocial individuals who lack empathy or remorse. So that's, again, going to impact their agency. They're more impulsive. So again, same sort of issues. Mm-hmm. But the difference with psychopaths is they're probably much more dangerous than children or people with addiction when it comes to what they're capable of, at least some of them, right? Because they have that violent antisocial sort of tendency. So there you might think, well, it's not going to, automatically you might worry about whether they are responsible enough if they have that reduced agency to be blameworthy in a retributivist sort of sense. But consequentially speaking, you might think, would punishing them do anything? Can they be rehabilitated? The prospects of that right now are pretty dim. Psychopaths also tend to be pretty egotistical. So they probably think, I'm not going to get caught. So you're not going to deter them by saying, well, yeah, somebody else would go to prison, but I won't. I'm too smart. Right? They're not going to catch me. So usually what we're going to justify punishing them with, if we call it punishment, is just the incapacitation. But if they don't deserve punishment, right, they don't deserve harsh treatment, then that's where the quarantine model might become especially important, right? Mm-hmm. So the key point there is, I think, whether you're a retributivist, a consequentialist, or a mixed theorist, when you get these sort of atypical agents who have some sort of reduced agency, everybody will philosophically probably be on board with punishing them less or not punishing them at all. Mm-hmm. But there's just going to be different justifications for why we do that.
Yeah. Well, we're going to cover other topics along the way this season, but we should note that we're just scratching the surface, and there's many other topics that we could have chosen. So before we wrap up, are there any other topics that you'd like to mention that you find especially interesting?
Yeah, I'll try to limit myself. So I think, the first, as the free will skeptics and the advocates of the public health quarantine model that you've had on the show before, they remind us there's various social determinants of crime, and people who suffer from poverty, abuse, violence, housing issues, poor education, right, limited access to healthcare, poor nutrition, like we mentioned, all that stuff, they're likely to engage in criminal behavior. So I think one interesting question there, which you've sort of explored a bit already with skeptics, but is just, what that says about our agency, whether it means people aren't responsible, whether punishment would be justified at all. A lot of the skeptics will appeal to those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. But I think an important question there is, if we could properly address those socially determinants of crime, would that make punishment largely unnecessary? I think if people are committing crimes because of social insecurity and the state gives them that security, there's a potential for the crime rate to go down. And we focus a lot on responding to criminal behavior, but I think the public health quarantine folks are right that we can do a lot more on the front end to prevent criminal behavior, right? Yeah. So usually when I talk to my students about punishment, that's where it usually ends up is, well, yeah, we're talking about whether all the stuff on the back end is justified, but why don't we just try to fix the problems before they arise? I think second, there's this notion of pre-punishment. So if we had good evidence that somebody was going to commit a crime, would we be justified in punishing them beforehand? And that's straight out of Minority Report. That's sci-fi stuff. Yeah. Right? But we also know, there's a lot of aggregated data out there on people. Maybe with the right algorithm, you could figure out whether people are going to commit a crime, or at least are likely to commit a crime. Mm-hmm. Now, retributivists would be appalled, right, at the sort of pre-punishment because you haven't committed any crime yet. So you can't deserve punishment for something you didn't do. But a consequentialist, if you're thinking, well, the goal of punishment is crime reduction. If we can punish you before you actually commit the crime, we reduce crime, we satisfy our goal. So that's maybe a justification for doing that sort of pre-punishment. And I think we don't have pre-punishment now, but we do have something sort of similar, which is predictive policing, police already use predictive policing, right? So they'll send more officers to areas where they anticipate more criminal behavior happening. And they're going to use that. There's various algorithms that they use to determine this, statistics they use to determine this. And a lot of us think, it would be good if the police were more proactive, if they didn't just have to respond to crime so that somebody gets hurt and then they're there, if they can prevent that bad thing from happening in the first place. But the problem with this sort of predictive policing could be that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So you send more officers to an area expecting more crime, so you'll have more officers to patrol. Those folks are going to give more citations, arrests, right? So then it's going to look like, there is more crime in that area, and then that just reinforces the behavior. So it's an important sort of question there, especially for social justice, because that usually happens in poorer neighborhoods or minority-populated neighborhoods.
Right.
I think the third sort of thing that I think is really interesting is, but also really frustrating, is proportionality. I assume that most people find it intuitive that punishment should be proportional, but so we shouldn't put you in prison for 50 years for stealing a candy bar. But what makes punishment proportional? How do we determine what that proportional punishment is? For all that's been written on this issue, proportionality is still pretty mysterious. And even when it comes to two people who commit the same crime, it's not obvious what proportional punishment would be. So when I mentioned earlier with the fines about Elon Musk and I, so say Elon Musk and I are speeding. We both speed 15 miles per hour over the speed limit. On the surface, you might say, okay, well, you committed the same crime, you get the same punishment. But on the other hand, you think, well, $200 fine, say, I don't know how much a speeding ticket for that is, but $200 fine, for me, is going to make a bigger impact than it will on Elon Musk. So then is that where the proportionality comes in? Have we actually proportionally punished? And that sort of question about proportionality with fines is why some countries use day fines, where the fine is a certain proportion of your wealth for however many days we think the offense is worth. So that means that a speeding ticket for a wealthy person in some of these countries, especially Scandinavian countries, could be tens of thousands of dollars, right? And the idea is that's supposed to be proportional.
Right.
I think that the problem with fines, well, not the problem, fines are maybe the easier sort of case because we're just working with money and numbers, but things get a lot more complicated when you think about prisons because there's variations in conditions and those sort of relationships people have and the sort of jobs people have, also the length of time. We just use length of time right now, right? You get 5 years in prison. But some people have families, they have kids, they help support the household with their income. So going to prison for 5 years is going to be a much bigger deal to someone like that than a bachelor with no significant obligations, right? So if we're thinking, well, yeah, the day fines sound good. Well, should we be adjusting how long people are in prison as a result of that sort of stuff? And that's really messy and complicated.
Yeah.
I think the last thing to say is that it's also important when we think about punishment to think about what happens after punishment, what sort of restrictions are in place for ex-offenders and why. And Zach Hoskins has done really good work on this topic. In many states, when people are released from prison, if they're found guilty of a felony, that's going to impact their life until they die. They might not be allowed to vote. They have restrictions on housing or what sort of jobs they can get, right? They maybe can't even get public assistance anymore. And that, again, can lead to future reoffending because it's hard for them to get back on their feet. So, again, the question comes down to who should we be blaming for this sort of recidivism? It's important to note that policymakers might say, well, these restrictions aren't supposed to be punishment, right? We go back to our definition of punishment. Yes, we foresee that these restrictions are going to make your life harder, but we don't intend for that to happen in response to what you've done. These are administrative safety measures, right? They're meant to protect society. So it's more consequentialist in nature. That seems plausible with some of the restrictions we have, right? If you've been found guilty of sexual crimes against minors, for instance, maybe it makes sense to say you can't live near a school because on the chance that you're not actually rehabilitated, we don't want to take a risk that any children get hurt, right? But same thing for violence, right? If you have a history of violence, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to own a firearm. But there's other things like voting, in particular, it doesn't seem to pertain to safety. It seems to hinder the reintegration and rehabilitation process. So I think it's important, especially for those thinking about the implications of philosophy on policy, to really examine what sorts of restrictions we put in place on people who have done their time, and whether those restrictions are justified.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks again for joining us, Kyle. This has been excellent. If people want to see what you're working on, want to chase down some of your papers, where can listeners go to follow your work?
You can find my work on Phil Papers or Google Scholar. Probably easiest, though, to go to my website, which is kylegfritz.com. That has links to my papers and notes about work in progress.
Sweet. We'll link that in the show notes.
Cool. Yeah, thanks again, Kyle.
Thank you.
Next time, we'll talk about theories of punishment. Our guest will be Aaron Kelly, Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University.